The engines droned above, a steady hum that filled the night sky. At first, it was just a distant murmur, blending into the wind, but within moments, it became undeniable. The low growl of approaching aircraft sent a ripple of unease through those on the ground. Eyes turned upward, searching the darkness, trying to make out the shapes cutting through the clouds. Then came the first flashes, glimpses of silhouettes moving against the dim light of the stars. It was happening. The realization struck hard. The Americans were above us, and they were coming down fast. The first parachutes unfurled like ghostly specters in the moonlight, billowing wide before their figures followed, descending in near silence. The sight was surreal. Hundreds of shadows drifting down, barely making a sound as they slipped through the air. The wind carried them, their movements controlled, rehearsed, deliberate. They were not scattering in chaos. They were landing with purpose. A moment of stunned silence gripped those watching from below. There had been whispers of an airborne assault, but no one had expected it to unfold like this. The land beneath us had long been prepared for war, but nothing had prepared us for the feeling of being surrounded from the sky. We had fought battles before, dug trenches, fortified positions, and built defenses along roads and ridges. But now none of it mattered. This was an attack from above, where no trenches could shield us, no barricades could hold them back. Orders were shouted, rifles raised, but the enemy was already upon us before a single shot could be fired. Some had landed so close that their boots touched the ground before anyone could react. The first gunshots rang out, sporadic, disorganized, as panic spread through our lines. The soldiers closest to the drop zones fired blindly into the air, hoping to strike something before it reached them. But for every paratrooper caught midair, dozens more landed unharmed, already moving, already engaging. Flashes of gunfire erupted across the open fields, cutting through the darkness. Some of the paratroopers hit the ground running, tossing grenades into supply depots, targeting key outposts with deadly efficiency. Others used the element of surprise, slipping into trenches before those inside even realized they were there. In mere moments, they had turned our own defensive positions against us. Communication lines were severed before reinforcements could be called. The enemy had chosen their landing zones wisely. Roadways, bridges, and crucial crossroads were all compromised within minutes. What had once been secure routes for transport and escape were now overrun, blocked by soldiers who moved with ruthless coordination. They weren't fighting for ground, they were taking it. Those caught in the first wave of fighting scrambled to regroup, but the confusion was overwhelming. Every time someone turned, another figure emerged from the darkness, another set of boots hitting the earth. The Americans were everywhere, their numbers multiplying with every passing second. Some of our men tried to retreat towards secondary defensive positions, but the pathways were already compromised. The enemy had predicted every move, sealed every exit. Tracer rounds streaked through the night as machine guns roared in defiance. For a moment, there was a desperate attempt to push them back, to regain some semblance of control. But they fought differently. They did not wait, did not hesitate. They moved with a precision that seemed impossible for soldiers who had just fallen from the sky. They were trained for this exact scenario, for chaos, for confusion, for battle in the darkness. Minutes stretched into eternity. The ground shook with explosions as the enemy targeted ammunition stockpiles, ensuring we could not fight for long. Gunfire echoed from every direction, bouncing off trees and buildings, giving the illusion that there were more of them than there actually were. Or maybe it wasn't an illusion. Maybe they really were everywhere. Some of us tried to hold ground, forming last-ditch defenses where we could. A few units managed to hold their barricades, firing from behind sandbags, holding off the advance for brief moments. But it was never enough. The paratroopers were not here for a prolonged fight. They were here to overwhelm, to break every line before a proper defense could be organized. The field that had been calm hours ago was now a war zone. Smoke from burning supply dumps curled into the sky, casting eerie shadows over the landscape. The air was thick with dust, making it harder to see, harder to breathe. The scent of gunpowder mixed with sweat and earth, the unmistakable stench of war. The men around me fought with everything they had, but there was a sinking realization settling into every mind. We were losing this battle before it had even begun. The sky had turned against us, and with it, so had the land beneath our feet. We were surrounded before we ever had a chance to fight back. The battlefield was no longer ours. The American paratroopers had carved through our defenses with terrifying speed, moving with precision, sealing every escape route before we could even regroup. What had once been a fortified position was now a chaotic battlefield filled with the sounds of shouting, gunfire, and the steady thud of boots advancing relentlessly. Smoke drifted through the air, thick with the acrid scent of burning supplies, torn earth, and the metallic tang of spent ammunition. The night, which had once provided us with a sense of security, now felt like a trap closing around us. We had tried to mount a counterattack, but every attempt was met with overwhelming force. The paratroopers had anticipated our every move, cutting off supply routes and eliminating key positions before they could be reinforced. Roads that should have led to safety were blocked, with fallen trees and debris forming barriers that had been placed with careful intent. The enemy had turned the landscape against us, leaving no way forward and no way back. The confusion spread like wildfire. We couldn't tell how many of them there were, only that they were everywhere. They moved in small groups, each squad covering the other, advancing through trenches, slipping through alleys, taking cover behind broken walls. They didn't need to overwhelm us with sheer numbers. Their tactics ensured that we were always outmaneuvered, always reacting rather than attacking. Inside the remnants of a command post, officers barked out orders, but the static-filled radios offered little hope. Communications had been severed early, and no one could say if reinforcements had even received our distress calls. Every attempt to re-establish contact was met with silence or the distant sound of gunfire. There was no way to know if help was on the way, or if we had already been written off as lost. Some soldiers, cut off from their units, tried to hold their positions, firing from rooftops and behind barricades. The bursts of gunfire flickered in the darkness, brief flashes of defiance against an advancing enemy that showed no sign of slowing. Grenades exploded in alleyways, sending debris scattering, but even these desperate acts of resistance only delayed the inevitable. For every shot fired, the paratroopers had already moved, adapting to the terrain, using the cover we had once thought was ours. The worst part wasn't just the enemy's precision, but the realization that they were forcing us into a tighter and tighter pocket. It was a slow, crushing inevitability, our options dwindling, our numbers thinning. Those who tried to break through the encirclement found themselves facing more gunfire, more barriers, more of the unseen force that had descended from the sky and now commanded the land. The wounded lay scattered, some still gripping their weapons, refusing to surrender even as their strength faded. Medics rushed between cover, dragging the injured into buildings or behind crumbling walls, doing what little they could before the fight found them again. The sound of their hurried bandaging was drowned out by the ceaseless echo of battle, the rapid reports of machine guns, the shouts of orders that barely reached the men they were meant for. Then came the most chilling sound of all, the steady, methodical advance of enemy boots. It wasn't the wild rush of an attack, nor the disorganized scramble of men trying to reposition. It was steady, relentless. They knew they had us. They weren't rushing because they didn't need to. They were pressing forward, clearing each sector, taking each street, knowing that the moment we hesitated, they had already won. We tried to reposition, to form new defensive lines, but it was a desperate attempt to hold something that had already been lost. A handful of men, low on ammunition, crouched behind a pile of sandbags that had once been an outpost. Their hands were steady, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They knew this was the last stand. They were not holding the enemy back. They were delaying the inevitable. Explosions rocked what remained of the defenses, fire illuminating the night sky as supply depots were set ablaze. Ammunition dumps, once a lifeline, now served only to fuel the destruction. The paratroopers pressed forward, pushing us further into the ruins, step by step, bullet by bullet. The ground we had fought to hold was slipping away beneath our feet. Some men broke from cover, making desperate runs toward escape routes that no longer existed. They were cut down before they could even reach the next alley, their bodies falling where they stood. Others held on, gripping their rifles with white-knuckled hands, waiting for the enemy to appear before firing their last rounds. Then came the silence between gunfire, the gaps growing longer, the return fire growing weaker. Our weapons ran dry, our defenses fell apart, and still they advanced. The American paratroopers had not just taken the battlefield, they had broken it, shattered every last hope of turning the tide. The realization came slow, but it came nonetheless. This wasn't a battle anymore, it was a collapse. We were no longer fighting to win. We were fighting to survive. The sounds of battle had not stopped, but they had changed. The initial chaos had faded, replaced by a slower, methodical advance. The enemy no longer needed to fight their way through. They were simply sweeping up what was left. The paratroopers had cut through our lines, severed our routes, dismantled any coordinated defense we had left. What remained was scattered resistance, pockets of soldiers still holding on, not because they thought they could win, but because there was nowhere else to go. Smoke drifted through the ruins of what had once been our stronghold. Buildings still smoldered, their walls caved in from explosions, the ground littered with shattered bricks, spent casings, and the wreckage of weapons that had been destroyed before they could be used again. The men who had survived the first wave of the assault were either pinned down or slowly being pushed into tighter corners, forced back street by street, alley by alley. The enemy had taken complete control of the battle, and they were ensuring that no resistance remained. Some of our soldiers had managed to dig in behind makeshift barricades, overturned carts, collapsed buildings, anything that could shield them from the unrelenting firepower. They clung to their last magazines, checking and rechecking their weapons, knowing that once their bullets were spent, there would be no resupply, no fallback plan. They spoke in whispers, passing what little they had left between them, making silent agreements about when to fire and when to move. But it was clear to everyone, this was the end. The paratroopers moved with unsettling confidence. They no longer rushed through the streets, no longer threw grenades into every doorway out of fear that resistance might be waiting. They knew they had won. They walked now, rifles raised, scanning their surroundings, clearing each position one by one. Some buildings had been abandoned by their defenders, but others still held men too stubborn or too desperate to surrender. Each of these final holdouts was met with precise, overwhelming force. No second chances, no time wasted. The enemy moved in, cleared the space, and moved on, leaving nothing behind but silence. The radio operators who had managed to keep their equipment working had stopped transmitting. There was no one left to receive their messages, no orders coming through, no reinforcements responding. Some had simply destroyed their radios, unwilling to let them fall into enemy hands. Others continued calling out names, hoping for a response, listening only to the static that confirmed what they already knew. No one was coming. A few men still tried to escape, but every attempt ended the same way. There was no way out. The roads had been blocked, the fields surrounding the town secured, the bridges destroyed or under enemy control. Any movement away from cover was met with gunfire before a single step could be taken. The remaining officers understood the reality of the situation, but some still gave orders. Not to counterattack, not anymore, but to hold on as long as possible, to delay, to buy time for others to disappear into the ruins, to slip away under the cover of smoke and fading light. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to deny the enemy a total victory for just a little longer. A group of paratroopers moved through the remains of what had once been a supply station, stepping over shattered crates and the bodies of those who had tried to defend them. They had been given their orders, and they carried them out with machine-like efficiency. They were clearing the last few sectors, ensuring that when the final shots were fired, there would be no one left to fight back. Those who still had ammunition used it sparingly, taking careful shots, forcing the enemy to waste time and resources hunting them down. But each shot was answered with return fire, and with every passing minute, the resistance grew weaker. One by one, the last defenders fell. The sun had begun to rise when the final echoes of battle faded. The paratroopers stood among the ruins, their weapons still ready, their eyes scanning for any sign of lingering threats. Smoke curled into the air, mixing with the cold morning mist, a grim reminder of what had taken place. The battle was over. The last holdouts had been silenced. The stronghold had fallen. The paratroopers had completed their mission, and there was nothing left for us to fight for. Defeat had come, not with a single moment of surrender, but with the slow, crushing realization that there was nothing more we could do. The ground that had once been defended with everything we had was now theirs. The sky had brought them here, and the land had been taken from us. You said,